When you look at the liturgical year in the Christian community, the cycle of our festivals, you've observed that the first half of the year is really congested with those festivals. We change colors on our altar constantly. We hear those very different messages from the spiritual world. We call them epistles in the beginning and at the end of the service. Just like today you've heard the Michaelmas epistle, which brings this amazing picture, the icon, the modern icon of the being of Michael. The second part of the year has pretty much only two big festivals. That of St. John the Baptist, we're celebrated on the 24th of June for 4 consecutive Sundays, and that of St. Michael, Michaelmas, which begins on September 29th. And when you take those festivals, the cycle of the year, as a picture of other cycles within the evolution of humanity, even within your own biography, that one can come with the thought that through the first period of our life, our liturgical year, our evolution, we were really truly led into the event of incarnation of Christ. From Advent, the great expectation, all through those stages, all the way to Easter. Then through the great event of Ascension, when his life spirit joined with the planetary body of Earth forever and ever. And the event of Pentecost, when the consciousness of this event was given to human beings like us to cherish forever and work out of it. And the second part of this year, of our biographies, of Earth's evolution, truly belongs to us. And as sort of two witnesses, two pillars, two great helpers, we do have those two great individualities, that of John Elijah and that of Archangel Michael. Rudolf Steiner actually pointed out to the fact that there is a connection, very deep connection between these two, between Michael and John the Baptist, the bearer of the great Adamic soul. Namely, that spiritual individuality, Michael, of whom we hear in the epistle that his feet are free of the weight of earth. That means, as a spiritual being, unlike Christ, he's never incarnated to the level of physical body. Elijah, the bearer of the great soul of Adam, who reappeared, as is confirmed by Jesus in the Gospels, as John the Baptist, is, according to what Rudolf Steiner shared with us, is an earthly emanation, as if, of this great spirit of Michael. Emanation, not quite incarnation, not quite incorporation, but a being, a human being, who in a mysterious way becomes a vehicle of the Michaelic power on earth, and is able to reincarnate as this great Michaelic presence in different times of Earth's evolution. When we look into the stories of Old Testament, that individuality of John the Baptist appeared at least twice. One in an individuality that is depicted in Exodus as a human being by name Phineas, and then a couple hundred years later as the prophet Elijah. And when you look at these two, Phineas and Elijah, there is always a gesture of fighting, of confronting evil in a particular capacity, an evil that is trying to distract, disturb, or even discontinue the rightful path of human evolution. And that rightful path of the human evolution is something that Rudolf Steiner called in the occult science the path of the Grail. There is a goal that is set for humanity, for a human being, by the divine world, by the spiritual world, which we are to fulfill. One can say the path of the Grail is also the path of moral development. And not only in my particular biography, that too, but as humanity as a whole, from the time of Adam, the first man, Adam and Eve, all the way to the time when humanity will no longer be able to dwell in the physical bodies as we are today. And when you look at these stories of Phineas and particularly of Elijah, which is in a way reflected later in the story of St. John the Baptist, there this confrontation with evil always has to do with challenging authority, challenging establishment, what we would call today establishment. During the time when the original kingdom of Israel, that established by King David and followed in glory by his son, one of his sons, Solomon, went into decline. And the reason for that was that after Solomon died, the northern tribes did not recognize Solomon's son as the right successor on the throne. And this caused an enormous tension and a split, so much so that the kingdom was divided. Those who followed Solomon's wishes stayed together, only two tribes, that of Judah and that of Benjamin. They stayed around Jerusalem, took over the possession of the temple, the Ark of the Covenant, as a legacy of their forefathers. And the rest of the tribes decided to go either their own path, their own ways, or like the northern tribes, elected their own king. And here we're touching on this element which I brought in our conversations a number of times, namely this unique character of the Holy Land. This is a legacy of Emil Bock, one of the founders of the Christian community, the second Erzoberlenker, who in his through his journeys in Holy Land, through his incredible insight in the etheric being of the Christ, was able to bring this picture that in nature, in the archetype of the Holy Land, in its polarity between the north and the south, actually the polarity of all Earth's evolution, kind of an archetypal geography is given. This is the Holy Land in my version. This is Jerusalem. This is Jordan and the Dead Sea. Towards the south, Holy Land and all other lands, spiritually speaking, are always under the influence of Egypt, quote unquote. And Egypt with its culture represents a spiritual influence, namely, in a certain sense, going a little bit too deep into incarnation and discovering the forces of death. The whole story of Egyptian mysteries are all related to cultivation of death and life after death. Polarity to that is influence that the Holy Land was always experiencing from the northeast particularly, and that is the region of what was called then Babylonia, Mesopotamia, with its kingdoms. In contrast to Egypt, Babylonia was based on spirituality of pre-birth, something that we will call also life beyond the threshold, but without yet entering the full incarnation of between birth and death. So you can imagine that all mysteries of Babylonia are actually those of procreation, of actually using, and in the late part of their history, abusing the forces, etheric forces that have to do with conception and have to do with forming the body of the human being in the prenatal stage. So on one hand, in Egypt, we have mummification, the mysteries of prolonging these forces, etheric forces, all the way to maybe 67 years after crossing the threshold. And in Babylonia, as a great legacy of the Sumer civilization, which in itself, Rudolf Steiner says, was the last great spiritual civilization. Babylonia took over their spirituality after the beginning of the Dark Age, Kali Yuga. And something that was pure and very refined, very spiritual, including beginning with their language. The Sumerian language was, according to Rudolf Steiner, the most spiritual language ever, because it was a language that was not able to express any evil or lie. Every word was expressing the truth. This, with the Kali Yuga, of course, in a state of unconsciousness, fell, so to speak, and became the legacy of Babylonia, and progressively was falling into decadence. So by the time when this split in the original kingdom appeared, that region of the world was, spiritually speaking, religiously speaking, very evolved, with huge, beautiful buildings and temples. The city Ur, the city of the original light, Babylon. We only rediscovered that in the beginning of the 20th century, among others, the great archaeologist Woolley. When they came there, it was just dust and of the desert, this modern Iraq, and started discovering the tablets with the original cuneiform writings. And today, after 100 years, one of the temple, the great ziggurat of Ur, is rebuilt. And of course, it's just a faint echo of the splendor of this land. You remember this, one of the 7 wonders of the world, the hanging gardens of Babylon. Again, expression of etheric forces. They were able to to cultivate plant forms and plants in a way nobody else was ever able to do. So by the time when these northern tribes got into contact with the echo of this once great culture, it was heavily stained with what is called sexual magic. So something that once was allowing through liturgical forms, through prayers, through dances and so on, was allowing, actually opening the way of human soul to incarnate, where of course sexuality is the key to this process, in time became very heavily abused. Of course, in a black magical way, people can do that. They can abuse etheric forces to their own device. Just to give you an example, these are things that you can confirm in historical research. One way that this was cultivated in Babylonian households was that the first born male child would be killed and buried under the floor of the house. That was considered a blessing. This is just an example. The so-called temple prostitution, this is all another subject, comes also from that region of the world. In fact, Babylonians and their temples invented what we call money today. When Elijah appears as a great voice of conscience that is calling on certain king of the north, King Ahab, who was married to Phoenician princess named Jezebel. Phoenicia is here. They were excellent merchants, mathematicians, insightful people, but then they themselves spiritually were under influence of this millennia-old spirituality coming from Mesopotamia. So Jezebel and in that name, you have kind of a key to the mystery of that individuality, was a priestess of a deity, God, who was the principal god in Phoenicia, migrated throughout the history from Mesopotamia. His name is Baal, or Bel. Jezebel, or Baal, was the high priestess of this being who 1,000 years before that, so before the dawn of the Kali Yuga, was a high spirituality, but in time became a decadent being. And just to give you a picture, what type of offerings would he desire from people? Also child sacrifice. That was notorious. When Ahab, who was Israelite, married her, of course it had political connotations, he all of a sudden was confronted by this voice of conscience of Israel by Elijah, the prophet. He comes like an explosion of fire. He challenges them, challenges her, and that rises her incredible fury. So as a punishment for that intervention of Elijah, she orders slaughtering of all priests of Yahweh. We have to understand that this is how that war was waged 1,000 years ago, when human beings were not as yet so deeply incarnated. In blood was the price. Eventually, Jezebel is able, through her magical abilities, so as a sorceress, as a high priestess, who through those cruel sacrifices has ability to also gain insight. She's able to pinpoint which human being is that vehicle of this great spirit of Elijah. Because it's not so obvious. He kind of comes out of, it's very, very ephemeral. And she knows, and she arranges something we would call today political murder. She kills him to her own demise, because of course Elijah becomes even more powerful. This is depicted in the symbol of his so-called ascension. Elijah doesn't die in the Bible like any other human being, but he's been taken into the spiritual world. So there is a mystery behind it. And very soon after that death, she and Ahab die in a very, very cruel way. So this gesture that through this confrontation with evil, he pays the highest price, and yet the great change, through the sacrifice, great change can come into human evolution. Darkness is being repelled, and something new, not only that stream of proper evolution is able to continue, but actually people around him, so to speak, becomes much more awake to the task at hand. Very similar story, the story of Saint John the Baptist, and there you can really venture to say we have to do with a particular way the karma works, because it's almost like it's exactly the same story, same individualities with in different times, hundreds of years later, in different names. Saint John the Baptist, Elijah, comes into confrontation with one of the children of Herod the Great, of whom we know from the Gospel of Matthew, also a black magician, by the way, who 300 years after Jezebel was cultivating the same type of spirituality. We know that through the picture of the so-called slaughter of the innocents described in the Gospel of Matthew is exactly continuation of mysteries of Baal and mysteries of ancient Mesopotamia. This is of course depicted often as Herod was bad. He was looking to kill Jesus because he was jealous. There is much more to it. In fact, Herod the Great, who was a quite powerful ruler, was fueling his power through terrible black magical events like that of slaughter of the innocents. His children who survived him had similar ways of accumulating power as their father had. You have to understand that this is a lineage we're talking about. Lineage. This is flowing in humanity for thousands of years. I'll just put it this way. It was covered by the lid of mysteries until quite recently. We're more and more becoming aware that those things are cultivated, and they always have to do with people who accumulate incredible power. John calls Herod's son, another Herod, Antipas, because Herod Antipas took a wife who was married to his brother. John the Baptist, and this is depicted in the Gospel, he's very influential. His word, that of forerunner, of preparing the space for the Christ, it becomes so widely known that Herod, he was very curious. He wants to see, and he wants to be seen too. So he goes where John is preaching, baptizing, and John does something that could, from a certain point of view, appear completely irrational. Namely, he, instead of taking this opportunity, we would say today, and connecting with someone influential, he sees Herod and he right away issues a very strong moral judgment, in fact, condemnation. You are married unlawfully to your brother's lawful wife. John got arrested right away and placed into a very special place. Before I go there, just one word about this wife. That wife's name is Herodias. And Herod was at this time around 7 years old. Yet she left her husband, who was way younger, but way less influential, and marries his brother. And because of Herod Antipas, she gains access to the court at Rome. Herod is a friend with Tiberius, with the second emperor of Rome, who himself is insane. It's progressively insane. By the time when these events are happening, which I'm talking about, Tiberius leaves Rome and lives on an island, completely isolated, completely decadent. One of the hobby that he has is to throw his opponents from a 30-meter high cliff into the ocean and watching how their bodies are destroyed by the rocks. So we're talking about interesting crowd here. What circumstances Christ actually incarnated into? It would be nice to say it happened then. It's not happening anymore because Christ is with us and we're all blessed. I dare say it's happening even more, even worse today, and yet Christ is really becoming present in the etheric realm. There is a need to speak about things like that out of this consciousness of the Johannian stream, Michael's stream, so we also understand what type of challenge and what kind of battle actually is at hand. John gets placed in a place which was then Herod's favorite dwelling. This is the Dead Sea. It was here on the eastern bank of the Dead Sea called Macherus. Both Herod and Herodias could have very well spent their time in their main residence here in Galilee, where near the Sea of Galilee, Herod built a city as a tribute to his friend Tiberius. North and south, Galilee and Judea. Galilee is a place of everlasting, always birth-giving life forces. You ever been to Israel? Galilee is a place of life. This is where most of Christ's healings are taking place. This is where the Sermon on the Mount is being placed. Versus Judea, which is a desert, and a stony, rocky desert, lifeless. As a quintessence of that gesture of Judea is the Dead Sea, the deepest place on the planet where all life ceases to exist. The beautiful Jordan River flowing, going through the heart of the Galilee, finally ends, spills into the salt-imbued waters of the Dead Sea. Nothing can live there. So much so that around the banks of the Dead Sea, there is no life because there's so much salt in the air. This happy couple found their dwelling in Macherus, which is actually a military castle built some 100 years prior to that. Macherus means the sword. Now, here's an interesting thing. Joseph Flavius, a Jewish historian, writes about this place. He, in fact, writes about the captivity of John the Baptist. Unlike Christ, John is a historical figure. There's no mention of Christ, of Jesus in the history of the Jews by Josephus. The persona of St. John is mentioned. And there, in conjunction with this arrest of St. John and placing him in the dungeons of Macherus, Josephus says that it was known at that time that around this place, around this castle, plants grew known as having extraordinary poisonous qualities. For instance, plants of which extract had such toxic workings on those who were given it that another person could control that person. If you would be given such extract, you would become eyeless person. People could control you. Through that, again, we have a kind of Picture into the soul of this Herodias. Who is she? She likes this kind of atmosphere, likes this kind of spirituality. John is there in the dungeon, and you perhaps remember the way he dies. This time around, there is a banquet. There are many people present. Herod requests that his stepdaughter, Salome, dances for him and for all his guests. And Salome, who is a daughter of Herodia, belonging to this ancient stream that begins in Babylonia, is skilled and trained since her childhood to dance in such way that the forces of attraction, the sexual forces, would actually be available. When you look at the oldest known poem, the story of Gilgamesh, that of Enkidu. Enkidu is a being that is still quite ethereal, is covered with hair all through, lives in the mountains with animals, with plants. And Gilgamesh, who is the most powerful, this is the biblical Nimrod, by the way, the great hunter, doesn't have an equal. And he finds out about the existence of this being, and he desires from now on to meet him and become his friend. He sends a temple prostitute who initiates Enkidu through the art of loving. And they spend a number of days together, and at the end, when he stands up, the hair, the coat that he was covered with, falls down. He becomes human being on earth. In this picture, mythic picture, we have a glimpse into those mysteries of Babylon, of using forces of attraction, forces of love. Salome has that skill, and when she dances during that meal, there is a moment when the men around, including Herod, they are losing their grip on reality. The king gave Salome his word: if you dance for us, I will do anything you want. And this is when her lovely mother calls the girl and whispers to her ear, ask for the head of John the Baptist to be brought here on a plate. What extent of evil, what extent of black magic we're talking about? This head of a human being on a platter. Rudolf Steiner spoke about it, that this is actually in deep black magical procedure called the Black Mass. Terrible things. Sad story, and yet something amazing happens. John is killed. Jesus steps very gently, very slowly into his place, but differently than John. The students of the followers of John come to Jesus like sheep without a shepherd. Christ sends them away. He sends them away. This is the first sending. He sends them for about 6 months. And after they come back, they're excited. The power of Christ is with them. They heal. They redeem. They work wonders. Christ takes them, they're back in Galilee, and here on Golan Heights, he takes them up to the mountain, and there on that mountain, an event takes place, which is the founding of the community of the disciples, the original Christian community, you would say, namely the feeding of the 5,000. The great spiritual vision and imagination of the future, where they see in this moment of elevation, this is not necessarily a physical situation, but they have this powerful group imagination. The streams of humanity are coming towards them. How are we going to feed them? There's this amazing conversation about means. Christ says, you feed them. And then comes this moment. There is a boy here who has breads and fish. Symbol that was always associated to the being of Elijah. You see, they, out of the spirit of Elijah, out of the spirit of St. John, murdered twice already, at least, they are able to form the first community of disciples, and it becomes a chalice that will feed the humanity until the end of times. Something we could say, this is the moment when the Grail became manifested in the circle of the disciples around Christ. So something tragic murderous, treacherous, actually brings about an amazing resolve. The soul of St. John becomes the patron, the leader, the common consciousness of individuals that are gathered on Christ. And later, on the way of initiation of Lazarus, and works through Lazarus, John, we have this picture of this beautiful grail of community. We are, in a certain sense, reconstituting this chalice of the grail every time we gather around this sacrament of bread and wine. The spirit of John Elijah, the emanation of Michael, blessing this offering every time we gather around the altar. We are becoming the chalice, the grail for the city around us, for the elemental beings around us, for people that we come in contact with. The Christ sun can shine through us further on. There is, of course, a concurrent stream that we could call an anti-grail. And it's not something that necessarily is an unconscious community, or it's not something that is generated by rejecting morality, being unconscious, being careless. I don't want to have any spiritual development. I don't care about any laws and rules. No, that's not enough. That's just, so to speak, the level of human freedom. Anti-Grail is a kingdom that is being consciously and intentionally generated as a force that will attract demonic beings into the life of human beings on earth. The critical character of our times is that we're becoming aware more and more that there are also people who are intentionally working against the Christ, against that rightful evolution of mankind. And these are people who also will make decisions for you and I because they are at power. And we need to know about it, and spiritually, instead of engaging necessarily in political fights, spiritually work as a counter force to that decadent world. Or we do it when we do Hallelujah, for instance, like we did with Gabriel today. When we gather around the altar, when we gather together in the name of Christ, when we cultivate practical anthroposophy. And I want to emphasize that not just theoretical, but practical anthroposophy. Meaning it's anthroposophy that is actually through your hands and feet working in our daily life. The son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. A very, very eventful life and biography, stretched between all possible crises and on the path of growing through them all the time. He was born as one of the twins. Esau was born first, born a few minutes before him, and Jacob came out of the womb of their mother holding Esau by the heel. Esau is, again, interestingly, all covered in hair, representing this ancient humanity, sun humanity, Adamic humanity, powerful, physically, etherically speaking, but can't cope with the intellectual forces of thinking, quickened intellect of his younger brother Jacob. It has consequences. We could say, on one hand, being tricked, on the other hand, by the divine ordering. Esau sells his inheritance as the oldest son to Jacob for a cup of soup, lentil soup. Then later, it's arranged by their mother, interestingly. So it's not Jacob's doing, but their mother who arranges actually that Jacob receives the blessings from Isaac, from their father, who's already old and blind. And in order to have these blessings, and she orders to kill a goat and places parts of the skin on Jacob. Their mother knew, she could see what a distance, evolutionary distances between them two. Esau had much more to do with Gilgamesh Nimrod. Jacob was destined to be the progeny of the future generations who will bring the body of Christ. So when he goes into this tent, the poor father is blind, he touches his arms and he thinks it's Esau. We have to be careful interpreting these points. From a point of view of a moral person to the ethical person, it's really a terrible deed to do. But from the point of view of a higher necessity of a right course of evolution, this is a good thing to do. Incredible. And yet, of course, there are karmic consequences for that, to that. Namely, he gets the blessing of Isaac, and Esau finds out and is curious, wants to kill him. So, young man, maybe around 20, he leaves from the promised land and journeys the way back, so to speak, the same way that Abraham, his grandfather, came. He travels back to a place called Haran, an ancient Babylonian city temple where the mysteries of the moon were cultivated. There he lives for 20 years, immersed in Babylonian culture. In fact, all except for one of his children, initiators of the 12 tribes, are Babylonian by birth, except for Benjamin. Benjamin is the only one who is born when he comes back to the Holy Land. We're not talking about a life of simple shepherds there, flocking their sheep. Haran was standing there for 3,000 years maybe. It was a city-state with temples adorned with gold. Jacob becomes part of this temple culture. He learns about spirituality of Babylonia from his uncle Laban. And there he wins his wife, actually two of them, Leah and Rachel. That ancient spirituality of Babylonia, the main deity, different cities had different gods, different temples, but there was one unifying deity for all of them, just like Osiris was the main deity of Egypt. In Babylonia, this is a god by name Marduk. And this Marduk is known through all the legends, through Babylonian religion, legacy of Sumeria, as the one sun hero who conquered the dragon. We have to think really precisely here. That being that we call Michael has always been there. It's not that it's belonging to this or that culture or this and that group. It's a being that is a reality in the spiritual world, which the initiates throughout the ages of becoming of earth were able to perceive. And this is why in different cultures, in different legends, the same being has different names, but the same attributes. For instance, the one who is conquering the darkness, the dragon, the ignorance. After 20 years of being there in exile, Jacob decides that he needs to come back home, now equipped with his children, 2 wives, a number of goods, priestly wisdom, the knowledge of the mysteries of Babylonia, of Haran. He comes back, but he knows that he has to confront his brother, who is a great, powerful ruler there. He comes from here, where the tributary by name Jabbok flows into the Jordan River. He has this amazing vision at sunrise. This is the third of the great spiritual visions that Jacob experienced. This time at sunrise, he is wrestling with an angel. Beautiful, iconic situation. There are so many paintings, poems, musical pieces made about it. Because we can all somehow, I think, relate to it, how we all have to wrestle with our angel sometimes. But this, Jacob's fight with the angel, is of gigantic consequences for entire Earth's history. But more than that, has also consequences in the spiritual world. And the Bible does not explicitly say what is the name of that angel, but we know 2 things: that Jacob recognizes that being, and he says that by blessing the place of that fight erecting another menhir. This is something that Jacob was doing notoriously. Whenever he had spiritual vision, as a device and blessing, he would erect the stone, same stones that you know from instance, from Britain, the Druidic circles. And he calls this name Panu El. El is divine, divinity, God, but Panu means the countenance. So, and he says, here I have fought with the countenance of God. Through that, we have an indication that he actually means Michael. So it becomes a little bit perplexing, considering that Michael is trying to wrestle with Jacob. On one hand, we could say not to enter into the house of his ancestry, into the Holy Land, into the Promised Land. But one can also say, and this is also indicated, that he's holding him back. You're mine. You were my priest back in Babylonia. And yet, Jacob prevails. And here is where his incredible intellect, the new human being, shows its power again. Because not only did he prevail over this powerful angel, but he says, after he won, I'm not letting you go before you bless me. He holds the angel back and he demands a blessing for his household. And that's what happens. As a device, as a gift of this blessing, Jacob and all of his descendants ever since receive a new name. Israel, the divine warrior, the one who fought with God, or the divine warrior. Jacob becomes Israel, and of course, after him, all his 12 descendants carry that name. That means that that spirit who was in the unconscious way from the past cultivated as Marduk leaves the temples and the spirituality of Babylonia and becomes spirit of an entire new branch of humanity that is destined to bring about the body of Christ in the future. What consequences it has? Had Jacob not fight with this angel, not only would he not receive the new name, but the angel would stay behind in an emanation that was already outdated according to where human evolution was. This is a picture of how human decisions, human actions, human suffering, overcoming of your karmic knots, what consequences it has for the spiritual beings that guide our evolution. They're not static either. Their evolution is contingent of our evolution. This is the great mystery. Also, especially of our times. You hear it in our Advent epistle, in the Christian community. Man's becoming is God's becoming. The becoming of the human being is also becoming of the divine world. Of course, the outer form in Babylonia stayed. People would, for 1,000 years, still cultivate that sun god, the hero, without knowing that the being itself, that the kernel, is long gone and has a different evolution. So that's the beginning of what is called in the Bible the worship of idols. The human being worships something that is empty of being. There's no essence, and yet appears as such. That is a story of Old Testament. That is a story of the chosen folk. You hear it in the Michaelmas liturgy of the Christian community, that being still evolved further. You hear it in this insert prayer. This is read after the creed, before the chalice is open. He who stood before the Father God, who now stands before the Son God. Through the mystery of Golgotha, through Christ's suffering, death, resurrection, ascension, the being of Michael has changed. He has shifted and moved in terms of his ordaining within the hierarchies. He is now the countenance of Christ. He is the great mediator between us, human beings, and the coming one. Just like Elijah, St. John was the forerunner, mediator, so to speak, between the chosen folk and the Father God. We have to be aware and we have to be clear that there is always a danger that even in our amazing work as anthroposophists, we are always on the verge of a precipice where we can fall back and start unconsciously worshipping idols. The power that we can generate for the world, the healing, is no longer contained in any organization or association. The power, Michaelic power, in our times is no longer a name for a group. To become the warrior of God, to become a true Israelite, this is beginning always with your I, with yourself. And then out of the self, community can be formed. Association should be formed and not other way around. Because all those things must today inevitably suppress freedom of individuality. Even if it appears as the most exalted, amazing institution that is to bring light and goodness into the world. To become a warrior of God is also not to use your muscle and fight when necessary with real weapons, certainly not, but is to have that amazing power of discernment. Discernment. Remember what happened, what price Jacob had to pay for his overcoming of the countenance of God? He was struck in his hip. Forever he became, we can imagine he became handicapped. He was always limping. That means that some power that from the Adamic time was sustaining and holding human being etherically as a fixed form, all the way to our bone constitution, withdrew into an intellectual capacity of finding balance between the light and darkness, between truth and lie, between good and evil. And ever since that time, human beings are truly left to our own devices to find the balance. It's no longer given to us by nature. Today, we're no longer the chosen folk. To become a warrior of God, to become a true Israelite, means to transition from a chosen folk, chosen person, to a person of choice. Only as a community of individuals who work out of the choice can we prepare the way for the etheric Christ to really dwell among us. So much. Happy Michaelmas.